Welcome to Healing and Growing with me, your host, Peter Gold, PhD. Join me and renowned teachers, healers, and practitioners as we explore the realms of healing and growth. If you're seeking a better way in life or just curious about new ways to expand and enrich your life, you have come to the right place. Welcome to Healing and Growing with Peter Gold, PhD. Welcome to Healing and Growing. I'm your host, Dr. Peter Gold, and today we have a very special guest. Leila Sadeghee is here. She is a yoga teacher and meditation teacher, retreat and pilgrimage leader, non-dual trainer, mystery school founder, and private client mentor. She has guided thousands of students into deepening their physical and spiritual practices and is dedicated to dismantling systemic oppression through her spiritual practice. Leila is also one of the most aesthetically inclined people I know and has nothing less than a brilliant sense of style and beauty. For all of these and many more reasons, I am pleased to have Leila Sadeghee here with us today. Welcome.
Thank you, Peter. What high praise.
Oh, yeah, for sure. For sure. All of it very well deserved. So we first met in 1999 at the Omega Institute for Holistic Studies in Rhinebeck, New York, where we were both working and living for the summer. And our paths have intersected and crossed a handful of times since then. And through it all, I have always admired your depth and sincerity and the depth and sincerity and intelligence that you bring to your practice and to your teachings. So thank you for that.
It's such an honor. Thank you for seeing me that way.
Absolutely. It's hard not to see you that way. You were born in the U.S., but have been living and working in Great Britain for nearly 25 years, correct?
Yeah, no, actually, I've lived and worked here on and off for the past 30 odd years.
30. Yeah. Amazing. I always like to give listeners an orientation of where guests are on the planet and how I know them. So that's kind of the context and history of our connection.
It is.
I'd like to start with something that I came across during my research for this conversation. Something that I saw that you said in a recent interview, because I think this approach to teaching in the spiritual, esoteric, and devotional realms is, at least in part, what I think makes your teachings unique. So you talked about your ongoing decolonization work and frustration with the white wellness paradigm of the contemporary yoga scene, which focuses on a kind of spiritualized perfectionism and optimization rather than spiritual awakening. And so just to start, could you unpack that a little bit for us? What do you mean by spiritualized perfectionism and optimization?
Great question. Okay, how am I going to frame it? It's going to take me a second to frame it.
Yeah, take your time. Yeah.
Essentially, a lot of people are using these practices to try and create a particular kind of an effect that they imagine that they want, but ultimately that's sort of the approach of white wellness in terms of there's a sort of, I'm going to have to start again. I'm just going to start again.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I've been in a lot of communities where, on one hand, there's a focus on some kind of a spiritual practice, but there's not an awful lot of clarity about what the spiritual practice is for. There's a sense of like a generalized getting better. And there's definitely, a kind of emphasis on a certain kind of performance of a kind of something, you know.
Hmm.
But ultimately, what I found increasingly was that I found there was a lot of emphasis on like this sort of attainment, like it's sort of out there, it's somehow separate from life, it's somehow, oh, we're going to do it by being really good. I mean, something that we work on a lot in the community of Mystery School, which is a sort of school for non-dual awakening and energy fluency, that I co-founded with Jaleesa Cypress, is to kind of like begin to break down some of this sort of tissue that we have built up through our lives in trying to be good and trying not to be bad. And what I find, in terms of the sort of perfectionist ideation that takes place, like, I mean, specifically in the yoga room, you have people who are like trying to do the poses really well. And they're trying to make their bodies do a particular thing. And they're basically sort of trying to beat their bodies into a certain kind of submission. And then they get high, they have particular benefits that they experience. They're in better physical condition or, feel better or something like this. But then as time goes on, their energy sort of flattens. And again, they have to go back to class and practice this perfectionism. And it's the endless kind of pushing away of a kind of ordinary experience of life and of being a living being that kind of ultimately characterizes a lot of this stuff. And instead of it being this ongoing inquiry into the nature of your existence, and an ongoing investigation of what this is to be a human being, what it is to be a body, what it is, what's going on in this world at the level of energy, at the level of experience. There's like a kind of bypass of all of that in favor of basically a lot of like kind of getting high, or and also increasingly, I also found having a sense of like being in community where everyone's very like-minded. So there's a few different things. Like I think I wrote what you. I think I'm recognizing some of the language of the question from an Instagram post that I wrote. I think
it was in an interview that I saw a transcript of.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, these are things that I've spoken about and written about quite a bit. I think that the understanding of what the goal of these practices are is pretty limited in a lot of the spheres I've traveled in by virtue of colonial extraction and the extraction of particular, behaviors and practices outside of a context, outside of a kind of understanding of the wider context from which all of this stuff comes. And then there tends to be this sort of repurposing it into this sort of, this attempt to become some kind of a perfected being, but not a perfected being in terms of like having real true wisdom, but a perfected being like, I don't know, like being someone who can do no wrong and who just simply doesn't do wrong. And, perfectionism is one of the great traits of white supremacy and of supremacy culture altogether. And so, if you don't simply see that for what it is and begin to understand like, oh, well, part of my sort of practice as a yogin, my practice as someone who's interested in spiritual practice, is to start to see how my perfectionism functions, how I've been indoctrinated into a culture of perfectionism, and how that shows up then in my spiritual practices, and then how to take that apart and how to do something else and what else there is to do. I mean, these to me are really vital questions that I find they're not really on the table so much. I mean, earnestly, I don't find, colleagues of mine that I've taught with often, broaching like, well, if we just say that like our spiritual awakening is something that's it's not something that's like someday, it's something that we want to really get a hold of and come to grips with and open our hearts to. And, it's costly because there is this necessary shedding of a lot of self-images and a lot of ideas that we'd like to formulate about ourselves. But, ultimately, if we don't do it, then we're just kind of creating more self-images that are sort of somehow spiritualized. And of course, what you have in white wellness culture, because it's very marketable, right, to keep people sort of attempting to feeling like this sort of state of being in a way that can't do any wrong or good in a way that's just definitely not bad, is like, well, we need to buy this product or invest in this kind of teaching or do something to get to that place. And then it's this sort of hamster wheel.
Okay,
Um,
let's slow down here for a second. This is all like it's very, very, very rich. So a couple of things that you said, like uh, the approach to practices, whether it's yoga, meditation, whatever, what have you, that seeks to be good instead of bad. In a sense, a kind of like the sense that you can do no wrong
yeah.
instead of, and that's like the root of like that's like the root of the idea of perfectionism. Like you can do no wrong. We're striving to be perfect so that we can do no wrong, versus doing the practices for more of the original intention of the practices. And so there's the purpose of the practices is kind of misappropriated and lost. Would you say that?
I mean, 100%. I mean, even, when you and I started, we were just little baby yogins,
Yeah.
at the Omega Institute. Like I was sharing with somebody recently that you were probably in the room too, Peter, that we heard Ram Dass give his first spiritual teaching after his stroke. Were you there up in the
I
sanctuary?
wasn't there. I didn't hear him give that talk. But side note, quick story. I was sitting in the cafeteria, and he was sitting in the cafeteria, and he was eating at a table alone in the staff cafeteria. And I was like, oh
Awesome.
my God, I got to say something to this guy. So
Sure.
I just pulled up a chair next to him, and I sat down next to him, and I said, hi, my name is Peter. And he looked at me, and he just looked straight through me, and he said, okay. And then he went back to eating. And I had nothing to say. I just got up and walked
Excellent.
away. I
Excellent.
just felt like I had to say something to him. But anyway,
Bravo.
well, I did miss his teaching. So tell me what happened there.
Well, I mean to say that we were little baby yogins and we had these teachers who were either actually from the original indigenous cultures that gave rise to these practices, or their teacher was, like in the case of Ram Dass, his teacher,
Yeah.
was an, Indian dude, and, very, very famous guru.
Yeah.
And so there was like a lot of proximity to the original indigenous culture that gave rise to the practices and the kind of teachings that were coming out of that culture.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've seen increasingly over the course of my career is a kind of further and further and further away expression of these teachings and the practices and all these things. And look, it's not as there can be great challenge. There's a lot of critique to be done within original indigenous cultures, like all cultures, that comes with its own version of supremacy culture and its own expression of supremacy. And that includes supremacist perfectionism and all of these different things. But there's a sense of like, a friend of mine says, there's not about like when the soil is depleted, there's not enough broccoli in the broccoli. This is actually someone, Heather Umlo was also at the Omega Institute. She says there's not enough broccoli in the broccoli. And it's a little bit like that. Like, so I feel like, wow, we've gone now sort of so far that the people who I know who are doing, yoga teacher trainings and kind of orienting to spirituality, even like going to rituals with facilitators, there's not this sort of sense of like, oh, well, this is something that's been passed down through particular lineage streams, that arises from particular cultures, that it comes from somewhere, and it comes then from a wider sort of worldview, basically. Like it comes from a place. It comes not only from a particular culture with particular paradigms that are different from the culture that you're learning this stuff in, but it also comes with a worldview. So you have like practice without like a real understanding of like what the real orientation of practice is. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, that's fine. On one hand, it's like some practice, I guess you could say, better than nothing, but then
Right.
you have an even this sort of like, post kind of spiritual practice thing that's happening, where it's really nothing. It isn't anything more than optimization, that you're being told, look, do this thing because it'll create this effect that'll make you a more optimized being in this world order, which is fundamentally, grounded in supremacist inequity.
Okay. So let's could you boil down the original purpose of, let's take the Indian practices, yoga, meditation. Could you boil those down? Originally, what was their purpose? What was their function within that culture?
I mean, look, there's, you're talking about an unbelievably vast level of history. And I want to just, before I say respond to that question in any way, just bow deeply to the proliferation of lineage streams and the incomparable wisdom and the amazing variety of potential responses that I think, folks from indigenous traditional lineage streams may choose to answer that question. And I'll say where I come from and what I've been oriented to and what my teachers have oriented me to is see things for what they really are. Recognize yourself as the divinity that you truly are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And then what?
Yeah. And then what? Then you get to find out what. Everybody's really, yeah, that's it. Exactly. And then what? Like, how do I optimize it? How do I market that?
Yeah, right. Exactly. Because it's like, we're on this spiritual path, and then a lot of people realize their true nature as not separate from themselves, but who they actually are, which is this kind of pure consciousness of presence and awareness. And then it's like you have to come back down from the mountaintop and live a human life. And I've always thought like the project of that is a very interesting one. I mean, I feel like that to a good extent has been kind of my experience. Not that but I feel like, yeah, it's easy to touch enlightenment on the mountaintop. But then when you have to come back down and live a human life in the world, it can be challenging. And then you can lose that thread of eternity that you touched when you were very deep in your practices. So what has your experience been like, kind of blending the eternal with the temporal in your life, and having to live and make a living and move through this messy world of material?
Oh, Peter, you got to come to mystery school. That's what this is all about. I mean, look, I don't know about a mountaintop. I don't have a lot of experience of having these sort of profound experiences in the sort of, vacuum of a certain kind of retreat or immersion, and then having to like come back to life and like, be flummoxed about what to do. I mean, maybe some similar experiences, but my direct experience of wakefulness as it rises in my life, it's an experience that's just part and parcel of everyday living. I mean, from in the first place, like, and I want to say, so there's a few different things. First of all, I think I'm going to use this term that comes from this fellow on the internet whose name I can't even remember, which is just terrible. Forgive me, fellow.
You're forgiven.
He uses this expression. He calls himself a paradigm grinder. He says what he does is paradigm grinding. And what he means by that is he says, look, any one paradigm is going to open up particular perspectives on reality, and it's going to open up particular revelations about reality and yourself, and it's going to open up streams of knowledge, but it will not open up other streams of knowledge. And so there's a certain kind of, spiritual kink that maybe like somebody like me, like I need more than one stream of wisdom to kind of open up the fullness of my own understanding of reality. That I just know to be true. And it's borne out in my life practices. I'm an Avalonian priestess.
What does that mean? What is an Avalonian priestess?
Avalon is a place. So it's a place that's physically oriented here in the United Kingdom, in a town called Glastonbury. But you could also say it's a dimension of reality that is sort of anchored on earth in that physical place, but it's a dimension of reality. It's a dimension of reality that's holds particular valences of magic and empowerment and sort of energetic understanding.
What's a valence?
A valence, bandwidth maybe is the closest.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I'm using that term very liberally because I believe it's a term that comes from physics to describe the sort of layers of where some of the subatomic particles or atomic particles sit, so in such a way that that they sit at a certain distance from the nucleus. I believe those are valences, right? So I'm using it kind of a little bit poetically.
Okay. But it's a place that, say that again, where it's kind of like a place that is a physical place, Avalon, but
It's anchored in a physical place. So, for example, you can go to Glastonbury. This is a priestess. I ran into a priestess on the street the last time I was in Avalon, and she said this to me, and she's right. And I do know this to be true. You can go to Glastonbury and you can have the experience of Glastonbury. You can also go to Glastonbury and actually go through on the other side of the veil and experience Avalon.
Okay. Okay. So what's the other side of the veil been like for you in Glastonbury,
or anywhere? Because it's on the other side of the veil, it can be accessed from anywhere.
Right.
It's been quite powerful for me. It's been for me a beautiful way for me to kind of tap the wisdom of this land. You know, I have ancestors who lived and died on the land here in this country, in this part of the world, in this island. And I'm aware that a lot of what's brought me here to the UK has been kind of receiving the benefit of that ancestry so that I can do some of my work in the world. And I really feel that my initiation as an Avalonian priestess and my deepening in the path of priestessing is part and parcel of that. So priestessing, you could say priestessing is akin to energy work or wizardry or ritual leadership or witchcraft.
Would you say shamanism?
Yeah, sure. I mean, what the hey? I mean, I find these terms more similar than dissimilar.
Okay.
You know, but they each have a certain kind of
flavor.
Yeah, a flavor, like there's a certain like connotation realm that sits around each one of these terms. And you know, I've done formal training as a wizard. You know, I've done formal priestess training. I orient as a priestess because certain pillars of the priestess path are very intimate to my heart. You know,
like which pillars?
One that's really particularly important for me is the art of blessing and standing as a blessing light in my life and in the lives of the people with whom I come into contact to the best of my ability. There's a lot of different pillars of priestessing. It's a kind of agendaless service and tending of resonance and tending the energetics, tending the subtle and not so subtle energetics of the spaces you walk through. The capacity to bring healing energy into situations.
So what does that look like when you bless, when you act out of a blessing or you bless something or someone?
Wow, it looks like a lot of different. What does that look like? What does it look like? I mean, I think that's a good question.
What does that look like for you when you know, coming from this realm beyond the veil of visible material reality? You're in Avalon, you're a priestess of Avalon, and one of the pillars that you love about it is it's blessing, like the practice of blessing, could you say?
Yeah, there's lots of different energetic gestures that I think are common to the priestess arts. One of them is blessing. Another one of them is a form of blessing, which is the anointing, which is to sort of like, you know, place oil, some kind of sacred oil, or even as just as some kind of sacred substance onto different points of the physical body. There's also the art of tending the vulnerable, tending. I mean, I think it's like this. I'll give you like an example of priestessing, like kind of on the go, you know. So if I get into a cab, this happened quite recently. Like the driver was not in a great mood and he was saying, like, he was just talking really negative. And I just talked to him and asked him questions, but I had the agenda in that moment of like really trying to leaven the situation. So this is something I've been focused on recently in my priestessing is like, how do I leaven this situation? How do I bring somebody closer to their own experience of their own divinity without saying anything about divinity, you know? So then, you know, in speaking to him and then, you know, kind of, he was telling me his story and we went deeper and deeper into like what was frustrating to him about his story and, you know, and what's missing for him. And I just was basically seeking some resonance between us where we could just sort of connect and in a way that would be beneficial. But I also wanted to kind of bless him and encourage him to like somehow, lift up his life state, because I could see that he was really, frustrated by circumstances. And I can see in him the capacity to not be so frustrated by those circumstances and to move with the circumstances in a different way, to move with them in a way that helps turn them around for himself so he's not having such a bad day. So basically, we went through the whole conversation. And by the end, I really had given him a lot of my love in a very kind of simple and straightforward way. I mean, it's not like super fancy. There have been other cab drivers where like I've had like exactly the essential oil that was helpful for his heartbreak, like weird stuff like that, where I happened to have this thing on me that I just gave it to him. So these are the sorts of examples of kind of basic, kind of ordinary life priestessing. But a lot of times, even just in greeting people, I try and I live in a country where it's perfectly okay to walk down the street and like not greet people. It's not like America,
Mm-hmm. Well,
it's
a lot of times in America, it's okay to do that.
It's a lot friendlier where I grew up in the States. But, just like really like I think, for example, here's another one. I think it's my job to walk into this space and bring the light.
So can you unpack that a little bit? Like when you walk into a space and you're endeavoring to bring more light to that place, what is that? Just unpack that. What is that? What are you endeavoring to do? What does that mean, bring more light?
I mean, part of it, sometimes it can be just something as ordinary as bringing my preoccupation with grace into the space. So then I'm just sort of thinking about grace and noticing that which is graceful and lifting up that quality, because that's what's predominant in my system. What's predominant is the sense that every step I take is a blessing. It's a blessing for my life to simply to be alive. And that awareness is really, it's not far from my thoughts a lot of the time, So then when I'm going into situations, I'm bringing all of that. I'm also, what else is I'm also, one of my preoccupations is to try and be better and better at noticing who the most vulnerable person in this space is and seeing what I can do for and that's a part of the decolonality, is just understanding like a true scale of vulnerability. One of the things that's really painful about what's happened in kind of contemporary spiritual culture is it's got so caught up in the optimization that the entire, like we then have communities around this kind of demented optimization striving, where the ticket to even get in the door is really high. And we've had to do some astonishing act of risk taking or whatever to like get the money to pay to get in the door, to be in this amazing situation, like walk over coals or whatever. But like, that there's like this simple, that other part of spiritual practice where it's like, okay, well, how can I tend the vulnerable on the, like on the planet?
Yeah.
Yeah,
which is, I mean, Mother Teresa comes to mind, as she would wash the feet of the lepers in Calcutta. I mean, that's a pretty vulnerable population.
Yeah, I mean, P.S. I make no claim. I'm very bourgeois. I make no claims to do anything as dramatic as like Mother Teresa, but I'm simply like, making a connection between the effort to decolonize my thinking and my sort of trying to see what true vulnerability is.
Mm-hmm.
To
decolonize your thinking. Let's talk about that. How do you feel like your thinking has been colonized?
Oh gosh, in every single way. I mean, in a simple way, every single time that I think to myself, I should be some other way than I am, that I should look different from how I look.
And that's the colonization of some other value system upon you?
No, it's the way that my mind has been colonized to believe that my acceptability has to be sourced through a system of hierarchies.
Mm-hmm. Beautifully so.
Where I'm able to, if not actually be, then at least put on the show of being in a higher position in the hierarchy than I actually am. Or to simply jockey my way into an actual higher position by hook or crook.
And instead of doing that, instead of that striving, many of the spiritual practices are leading us to understand and recognize that that we are complete in and of ourselves and more valuable than any hierarchy can assign value to us.
Beautifully said, Peter. Exactly. That's my regard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, no, because oftentimes, like, I'll encounter people in my psychotherapy practice that have no context for the idea that they are valuable in and of themselves.
Yeah.
That they cannot conceive of being valuable if they're not useful, if they're not productive.
Word.
And so I try to help them come to a place where they could at least entertain that idea.
Yeah.
But it's hard. I think it's hard because of this colonization or indoctrination into ideas that we're not enough just as we are, that somehow we have to strive to be better because we're not good enough, we're not enough just as we are.
I'm nodding.
Yeah. Yeah. For all the viewers, I can attest, or the listeners, she is nodding. Yeah, I think this is a very powerful idea. It's kind of an antidote to the dominant paradigm of consumerism. I wonder if there's been, I mean, I guess, here's the question, would you say that the original cultures that a lot of spiritual practices have come from have had this value, have had this idea inherent in them that we are enough as we are?
I mean, look,
That
I
we're good
don't know.
enough
Yeah,
without.
yeah. It's not, I think that there's paradigms, certainly the paradigms of some of the indigenous practices that I've received is taking it out of that. It kind of is taking it into a complete amorality. So it's like, well, we're not actually, we're understanding that. Okay. So I'll give tantric yoga as an example.
Great.
So from the perspective of tantric yoga, there is only one thing that's occurring, and that one thing is inherently complete and whole unto itself, requires absolutely nothing to prove it, but has opened its capacity to reflect it to itself.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Out of sheer joy, out of sheer desire, out of sheer capacity. And in so doing, there is this capacity for anybody who practices to come to the same, to recognize that thing that I just described, that inherent complete fullness, which is just like the fullness of life itself, is what you are. End of statement. Like, it's not is what you are when you feel, or it's not is what it is, just essentially and fundamentally what you are. And that this sense that there's this like individual me that's like kind of has to like formulate itself and reformulate itself and strive in particular ways, that this is just basically a complete delusion. And that what I am is the energy of life itself, and therefore the energy of the divine itself, because divinity is the very heart of life. And that there really, I am the concert of the universe or the multiverse or however you want to call it, whole and complete unto myself. And one is meant to then do practice to break down the distortions that sit in my awareness that prevent me from perceiving and accessing that direct experiential recognition.
Mm-hmm. Could you say in other words that it's the individual isolated sense of self or ego that obscures the ultimate reality of eternity that's dancing, that we are a part of?
Sure. I mean, yeah, I don't know if I would exactly phrase it like that, but it sounds great. I mean,
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I think that's part of a lot of Buddhist practice, is contextualizing the ego such that it's not the primary lens through which we experience reality, but rather a view that we can view the world from, but it's not the ultimate. It's not the ultimate reality.
Yeah.
The ultimate reality is everything.
Nodding again.
Yeah.
I mean, in tantric yoga, they talk about how, they talk about how there's the problem is that there's just a misunderstanding, that there isn't like a real, like necessarily a particular structure that the ego is or something like that. It's this understanding that one is, one's perception, the channels of perception, the psychic instrument is just, is receiving information through particular patterns of distortion. Mm-hmm. And they have this teaching of the three mullahs. And they say that the first and primary mullah is called the Arnava mullah. And Arnava means atom. So like the discrete unit. And basically it's this sort of force, or like this delusion that arises in consciousness that says, I am separate from the whole. I am imperfect. I am not complete unto myself. I basically it masks the fundamental fulfillment of being itself. And it says, I am this particular entity that is somehow separate from the fullness of the being of everything. Yeah. And then I am incomplete. And so it gives me this sort of feeling of like this kind of, it gives a person a kind of this tone of incompleteness, and then sets off this sort of, all these behaviors, we could say like kind of, this creation of behavioral patterns, and then the resultant laying down of particular samskaras, right? Mm-hmm. Which is the term in the tradition to say like these sort of grooves, patterns that your behavior creates in energy in the world and in yourself. And then there's one called the Maya Mullah that makes everything look like it's separate from everything else, basically. And kind of gives you the sense that like, that you're like acting in self, like that there's a sense of like, well, acting in self-interest is justified because there is this fundamental separateness. I don't know how to kind of, maybe that's not the best way to phrase it. I haven't taught this in a minute, but.
No, it's
and
good.
Then there's, there's the karma mullah, which is like that kind of even deepens this whole expression of kind of distortion and delusion about the nature of reality. And that one kind of says like, well, that makes it so like, well, then I have to do it all. So you've got the Anava kind of generating this intense need. And then the Maya Mala creating this perception that's shaped in this way of like real deep separation. And then finally this like drive to overcome it all, but that it's coming from a false perception in the first place. So it says, I have to do it. I am the doer of life. I'm the one. It's all my fault. It's all my responsibility. So it creates all this kind of delusion.
This reminds me of what we were talking about early on in this conversation about the oppression of the mind and the idea of all these practices being towards something that is different from the true purpose of the practice, of spiritualized perfectionism or optimization. And so I guess what I'm saying is that that feature of humans, the human mind, is in some ways baked in to some extent, because there are these practices that have recognized that and have provided ways towards liberation from those things.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you don't have a practice that critiques your perception at a kind of base fundamental, keep taking it right down to the bottom level, then you can have a lot of practices that generate a lot of energy that just tend to then magnify and make more profound the expression of the mullahs, if we want to put it in those terms. Mm-hmm. That actually like, because obviously the feeling of profound insecurity and separateness can easily sort of flip into the feeling of profound superiority. Mm-hmm. It's like, we know this, through psychotherapeutic paradigms. That the experience of inferiority and superiority are basically two sides of the same coin. Mm-hmm. So from like the tantric perspective, you could say like the entire system of the world, like the entire system of hierarchies of the world, hierarchies of inequity, hierarchies to oppress and even crush, actually destroy the bodies and the life and the livelihood of particular populations of people so that somebody else can then, I don't know, exist or thrive. All of these sorts of distortions that you see through the whole world of oppression culture would be understood in tantric terms as like the force of the Anubhamala operating at a lot of group level, particular individuals buying into their own particular experience of Anubhamala, and then coming together and creating these sort of symphonies of violence and genocide.
So it seems like, I mean, practice is a bit, I know practice is a big part of your life. It's a big part of my life. We both practice for a long time each day. We'd probably practice all day if left to our devices and our, but practice, I mean, the Dalai Lama practices are essential to keeping us sane. Wouldn't you agree? If you are enjoying this podcast, please take a few seconds to follow, like, and share it on Spotify and/or Apple Podcasts. It would mean the world to me, but more importantly, it will help other people interested in healing and growing find additional resources for themselves and others. I'll give you a second to do that right now. Good. Thank you so much. Now back to the show.
I've always been a great teacher of practices and the dailiness of practice. Mm-hmm. I posted about that on the social medias the other day. I saw a wonderful mystic that I follow had practiced about devotion and the dailiness of practice. And I mean, the thing about the dailiness of practice and having it really, look, any practice, anything can be used to strengthen distortion. Mm-hmm. So it's like poison can be medicine, medicine can be poison. Like it goes both ways. However, I would say that if you're really keeping it up every day and you're doing it at home by yourself with no help and nobody else but you to witness you, then there's a little bit more that there's a certain bullshit factor that's sort of cropped out of the scenario. It's like you kind of have to be real with yourself, and just to kind of get it done. Of course, you can easily do those practices on your own at home with the idea that you're, impressing some distorted spiritual leader that you follow.
Are you speaking to the importance of community? Is that what you're saying?
I think, well, yeah. I mean, I always view that community is really important. I mean, I think the formulation of the Buddha, which is known as the 3 jewels, is like really poignant and I think beautiful because it says basically, look, there's such a thing as awakening, Buddha. There's such a thing as pathways to awakening, Dharma. And there's such a thing as other people who are interested in those 2 things with you in the Sangha. And I do think that formulation is really incredibly valuable. But I also mean to say that I just don't want to make too much of like saying, well, if you have to be on your own every day and do it, then there's a certain bullshit that's cut out. Because obviously you could I mean, even myself, I've had practices where there's been plenty of bullshit until there wasn't, Mm-hmm. You can cultivate energy and turn it into oppression. You can turn it into anything you want. Mm-hmm. But that's because we're free. Like in a way, like I don't think that there's anything wrong with creating, like there's no inherent morality about it. I prefer not to crush the bones of other people if I can possibly help it. It's part and parcel of my life because of the part of the world I live in and where where my life is oriented. Mm-hmm. So I choose that with the blood on my hands that it leaves.
You choose what?
Living in what some people would call the imperial core. Uh-huh. Just of like living in the
Kingdom.
No, I happen to live in the United Kingdom, but a lot of the global north, another way to say the global north, say in the imperial core, places where the benefit of global inequity is being leveraged. Mm-hmm. Leveraged in the direction of the people who live in this part of the world and leveraged away from people who are oppressed who live in other parts of the world.
The global south.
Generally, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
let's talk about pilgrimage,
Oh my God.
because
I might never stop talking about it. You get me started.
because I know pilgrimage is something that's important to you, and you lead pilgrimages. So let's start with, what is a pilgrimage and why is it important?
A pilgrimage is the movement, either physically or psychically, towards a sacred place, a sacred location, movement towards sacredness altogether, you could say, and as a certain kind of pilgrimage. And it's important to me because I'm in love with energy. I love energy. Energy is what everything is. And the pilgrimage sites that I go to it's like receiving a kind of it's like a graduate school for energy,
Hmm.
because the energy of the places that I like to go to and the sorts of frequencies that are accessible there are not accessible in other places, generally speaking. I mean, they can be accessed through my own attention, certainly, but it's not like I can just go to a place and presume that I can have access to the kinds of frequencies that I have access to when I go to some of these pilgrimage sites. So
Mm-hmm.
there's that. There's also the gesture of making a pilgrimage, the gesture of intending to move across distance, across through particular perils, if perils are involved.
What's a peril?
A peril
Like,
is like a danger of some kind.
oh, okay, yeah, uh-huh.
You know, uh, you know, uh, the sort of like gesture of taking time to move in the direction towards the sacred. Then there's a whole dimension of journeying that's a part of that. And then as an energy worker, as a priestess, I love journeying as well. So then in the pilgrimage, in the arts of pilgrimage, you have all of these sort of awakenings that are just embedded in every single step of the journey. It's a great art of intention. I love ritual as well. For very similar reasons, but pilgrimage is like my super special fave.
Would you say a pilgrimage is a form of ritual?
It can be any. I mean, I'm very open ended about these things. I find these terms pretty. I use the terms pretty loosely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's nice to be specific enough to call a pilgrimage a pilgrimage. I think that's also true.
Mm-hmm. And so, like, I know that you lead pilgrimages. I think you're leading another one in 2025.
Three in
Three
2025.
pilgrimages in 2025.
Yes.
Where are the pilgrimages to, and what is the purpose of each one, or the flavor, let's say, maybe, of each one?
Okay. So the first pilgrimage is at the end of January and early February 2025, and it's called the Secret Pilgrimage.
Okay.
And this is a pilgrimage to Tamil Nadu, which is in South India. And we're going to some of the most astonishingly powerful sites where divinity has been uplifted, enshrined, worshipped, regarded consistently with absolute devotion for thousands of years, very consistently over the past 1,000 years for several of these places. In some of these places, you have the exact same rituals that were taking place in that exact same place, with the exact same descendants of the exact same family. The exact same thing would have happened on a Tuesday 1,000 years ago, as happens now on a Tuesday. Like it's really, really astonishing energies. Very profound energies are cultivated in these places. Now, listen, the South Asians are like have made the art of physicalizing the divine like such a high. They've like lifted it up, as far as I'm concerned, for the entire planet. The level of energetic specificity and in the design and in every step of even building these temples. So you go to a lot of temples. The temples have very particular kinds of energetics. The deities that are worshipped in these places have very, very particular kinds of potencies and they're like, they hold particular revelatory powers. And so when you put yourself into communion with these forms and in these places and get yourself around the people who are there tending these physicalizations, these sort of encapsulations of these divine frequencies of energies, very luminous and profound frequencies of energy that have the power to kind of crush the expression of the mullahs in your system in particular ways. Maybe not forever, but definitely to give you a glimpse of what's on the other side. Sometimes also to then work in your system in deep ways to dissolve the impacts of various psychic impediments, impediments of perception, so on and so forth. I mean, there's nothing like it. It's absolutely mind-blowing, impossible to describe.
Mm. And so the first pilgrimage is in southern India.
Yeah, South India, Tamil Nadu.
Tamil Nadu. And then where's the second one that you're leading this year?
The second one is Paris, Provence, and Montserrat, which is in Spain, just above Barcelona.
Wow. And what's the flavor of that one?
That one's called, so the first pilgrimage is called the Secret Pilgrimage, and that's because for so many reasons. It's about how the secret of our own nature is hidden in plain sight. So that's sort of part of what these temples can open up to us. Now, the next one is the Divine Mother Pilgrimage. So we're going to the forms of the Divine Mother. And I'm really interested in what I call, I'm really interested in practicing anti-imperialist spirituality in imperialist spaces. Mm-hmm. So you have this very, like what I call imperialist Christianity, mainstream schools of Catholicism and sort of orders and hierarchies of very rich, actually wealthy kind of Christian superstructures that sit around some of these sites and that have tended some of the forms or some of the energies. It's very much more form oriented than it is much more energy in some of these places than it is the forms. The forms are also very powerful. By forms, I mean like the statues and the sort of emblems and insignias and design of the churches and so on and so forth. But we go to Paris and then we visit 3 different forms of the Divine Mother there. We go to Provence and we actually are moving around in Provence. So we're in Marseille. There's a particular form of Black Madonna who's incredibly powerful there. We also go to the Camargue where there's very famous Sarah Lacali, who is the patron saint of the traveler people of the world. It's an absolutely incredible pilgrimage site right on the coast in the Camargue, which is a very magical region in France, in the very, very south of France. And then Montserrat, literally the Divine Mother is the body of this mountain. Mm-hmm. And there's a huge monastery. I mean, there's all this Christian superstructure on top of all of this. We also go to Saint Baume in Provence, which is where there's a lot of the Magdalene flame energies. So the Mary Magdalene light, which is also, I could say that I'm so connected to Mary Magdalene. I see myself as a priestess in the order of the Magdalens, despite having no formal training. I just am very attuned to those frequencies. And we go there in pilgrimage with those places as well.
So when the Divine Mother pilgrimage, it's kind of like different manifestations of the archetype of the Divine Mother, correct?
I mean, what you would, maybe to put it kind of in a very basic way, you have like sites that are very significant for what is known in Catholicism as the Marian cult. So the Marian cult is the cult of people who worship the Mother Mary kind of primarily, or feel that their way into connecting with God and to the divine is through Mother Mary. So in that sense, it's not so much, in my regard, even at the Catholic level, it's not so much archetypal as it is concerning the praxis of worship, like how worship is practiced. Now, I'm practicing anti-imperialist spirituality there. So I'm going as a priestess, I'm going definitely to connect to the wisdom streams that these energy sites hold. Now, we know that Christianity is an overlay on top of all of Europe. Mm-hmm. It was co-opted from a Near Eastern energetic art world. You could say that the Christ family were great energy workers of the ancient world. And then you have this proliferation of their teachings at a very unstable time.
Wait, when you say the Christ family, what do you mean by that?
I'm talking about Yeshua, Magdalene, and the various people who followed Christ around occupied Judea before he was murdered. Mm-hmm. And then taught his practices and teachings afterwards. in all kinds of different little schools. It was kind of, Christ family kind of splintered, and everybody went off to offer their testimony and to gather people to the teachings of that, Yeshua had left behind. And I mean, I have a lot of particular, like, personal kind of understandings about what happened with all of that. So that's my own take, that, comes from reading a lot of visionary literature, but also going to the pilgrimage sites, and also just like consistently listening and attuning to the Christ family legacy frequencies. And I think that what you have in the original Christ family and what that lineage is really about is about profound self-recognition and profound transformation, and like the truth of a good that has no opposite, and what that really means. It's basically profound non-dual awakening energy practitioner school that they were practicing at a very politically unstable time. And they were also political activists who did, high political theater and basically paid the ultimate price for it, as we know. And and then you have this, dissemination around the world of these practices, and then this complete co-optation of that into where the Roman Empire becomes the Holy Roman Empire. And then you have this, it becomes an imperial language and an imperial stamp form of worship that is then approved by the empire. And then it's a way to, sort of coercively can maintain a coherent, proper behavior of the various people who were, subjects under the Roman Empire, and then left its own hierarchies and legacies as things change through history. I mean, I'm giving like a history of Christianity that a lot of Christians would probably be like, who taught you that?
Right. Probably.
But that's basically the story is. So what I want to say is, but before all of these, the Christian imprint that comes directly through empire in Europe, through the, the Romans, you have, the indigenous practices of the Europeans. Mm-hmm. And so there was a lot of worship of goddess forms and goddess forms that sat at wells, that sat at sacred places. They sat at particular energy spots. Mm-hmm. And there's also we could talk about the ancient world teachings that come from Africa that were then disseminated through at least the southern part of Europe. Mm-hmm. There's so many layers. There's also the fact that Black Madonna, who is black, let's be really clear, is the Black Madonnas in Europe they're all over Europe. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Black Madonnas venerated all over Europe. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times the story of them is that they were just found on the land. So, in Tibet, they have the practice of leaving treasure in the land and also revealing treasure from the land. I don't know if you know about this. It's called Therma. Practice, the treasure revealers practice. It's amazing. My friend, Olivia Clementine, told me about it. Kind of blew my head off. But basically you have practitioners who are skilled at leaving treasure, leaving revelatory potency, like literally leaving wisdom inside the earth. But then the treasure revealers are those who have the high art of being able to see a treasure and go to that place and then bring the wisdom forward and reveal it at the right moment.
And this is like energetically, correct?
I think a lot. Yes. So let's say that. Yeah.
Okay. So,
but everything, in this view, it's not like anything isn't energy. Physical reality is an energy, is also energy, right? So,
right. Yeah. That's kind of what I was getting at, is that we live in such a materialistic age that the idea that energy has some reality is so foreign to so many people. It's like you're talking about worshiping goddesses at a spring. A lot like the materialist view on that is that this woman's crazy. Like this whole world is crazy. Like it doesn't exist because they can't sense it with their senses. But what I'm saying is that view, that materialist view, is a very exceptional view in the history of humans, in the history of the world. It's like, this is a very unusual time wherein energy is seen as some kind of mystic superstition. Right? Whereas, in most times, in most of the history of the world, it has been seen as the most, as just as, if not more real than the physical realms.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot that the study of the physical realms has given us in terms of science and medicine, but there's a lot that it hasn't given us, and that it's obscured from the energetic realms and the wisdom traditions that were adept at recognizing the gifts of the unseen world in this world, in the material world.
Hmm.
Thoughts?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So let's round it out. Where's the third pilgrimage?
Yes. Okay. So sorry, I could get really. I told you, you get me started on pilgrimage. Then we're talking about how Black Madonna is buried in the earth all over Europe, and it reminds me so much of the Tibetan tradition of the treasure revealers. I mean,
anyway, so just before you go on to the third one, when you mentioned the treasure revealing, the thing that I thought of, and it doesn't sound like this is what you were referring to, but when I was trekking in Nepal, I came upon this mound of stones with Om Mani Padme Om carved into the stones.
beautiful.
And each stone was like at least the size of the length of a big watermelon. And the size of the mound of stones, I mean, it was probably 150 feet long and probably 10 feet wide and probably 9 feet tall. I mean, it's just like the most incredible thing I've ever seen.
What an art of devotion, huh?
So many thousands, tens of thousands of stones. And Leila, these stones, like the carving on these stones was just meticulous. It was so clean and clear in Sanskrit. It was just
devotion.
It was so beautiful. Yeah. But I think what you were talking about is more like in an energetic realm. When you pilgrimage to these places, it's more energy that you're connecting with in these places.
I mean, look, I'm not, I would love to become a treasure revealer. I don't practice so firmly in Tibetan practice. You know, I don't have a formal study in that line, not since the earliest days of my own practices, so that I actually don't know. But I do know that the Black Madonnas that they pulled out of the earth all over Europe are statues. They are physical entities.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so last one. Third pilgrimage 2025.
So the last
What's happening? What's the flavor? Where are we going here?
We're going to Oaxaca in Mexico for Dia de los Muertos. We're going with people who've done mystery school. So folks who've done the mystery school intensive are invited. There's a slim possibility that we will open it to people who haven't taken mystery school, but we're basically going as energy workers. Mm-hmm. And to tune into the frequencies and to experience the sort of the magic that is practiced there. Because there's quite a lot of what I would call like ordinary magic. There's a lot of magic that sits in the folk tradition and sits in the energy of that time. And they open up the most astonishing portal during that portal through what's known in the Celtic and Avalonian traditions as Samhain, which is people call it Halloween, right? It's this. In the Christian tradition, it's the day to remember the saints and the dead in general, All Hallows. So there's this incredible, like very ancient tradition of lifting up, really elevating the dead and the family, elevating those who've passed away, going to the graves, literally going to the graveyards and singing to your ancestors, singing at the grave foot, and partying with them. And honestly, the dead, in a lot of places, I've been in a lot of places where the dead basically walk the streets. At Samhain. New Orleans is the only place I've been where it's like there's so many dead walking the streets that it's obviously every single moment of every single day. But the energy in Oaxaca is very special at that time. It's incredibly beautiful. The whole town becomes an altar. to give praise and to make this honoring of those who've passed. So it's very, very powerful energetically. And there's also just a lot of powerful energy in that part of the world. And we want to be with our mystery school graduates and attune to the different energies and go to these places. And, part of it for me as a pilgrimage leader is supporting energy workers and becoming more adept at working with energy. So you go to these places where the frequencies are higher, or, there's a kind of a greater intensity, and that can also help you become a more competent channeler of energy. And a lot of what I do, in my work, I call my work energy weaving. Work as an energy worker. I do 2 public energy weaving classes a week. And in that work, the people are channelers and I'm the guide. So it's very much consent based, because you have to consent to channel an energy, and you have to actually be the one who's channeling it, which is a little different from the model of like, I'm going to channel energy into you. That's not how I sit as an energy worker. I'm here to really empower people to become more subtle. These distortions of materialism that you're describing, there's nothing inherently wrong with being a materialist. And most materialists would say, well, I don't know about the energy beings that live at the spring, but I definitely felt better after I bathed in the water, like that's pretty clear, Yeah. So I feel like that's, even if it's very basic, everybody has a responsiveness to some of these places. But some of my life's work in supporting people and becoming more conscious at more subtle levels is expressed through this work. So go on pilgrimage to places which make it's so loud, like the subtle energies are so loud. And that's really what it's like at a portal like Samhain. When people say the veils are thin, what you could say is also that like the energy of like transactional and what we might call ordinary reality is just turned down very low. And that which is subtle, which is always present, is turned up very high. And so then suddenly what you have is the experience that you can move through the veils, but you're just in a condition somehow through the time of the year, through the particular place that you happen to be practicing, through various means. What you are able to do is bypass your own habitual attention on the transactional and attention. And then we do this, collectively. And that's collectively done at the level of the entire town, actually the entire country. But Oaxaca is one of the famous places in Mexico to go for the celebration of Dia de los Muertos. And my collaborator, Julissa, in Mystery School has lived in Oaxaca. We've both journeyed there together and journeyed for the Dia de los Muertos portal there. So we are happy to be going back and taking some of our students with us. But that's part of the reason that we're going, is also her familiarity with the place. And these places we found some very amazing places of energy there. Really astonishing.
Well, for people that want to know more, learn more, maybe go on a pilgrimage, where can they find you? How can they contact you?
I'm really the kind of person who would like hand out my phone number on a podcast, but probably the best way to get in touch with, like the most normal way for me to respond to that is to say, you can go to my website, which is leilasadeghee.com. Listen, the secret pilgrimage to India is by invitation only. So I'm increasingly wanting to move towards an invitation model rather than just like opening to the public and sell, because I don't want to sell holidays. I'm not interested. I've taught many yoga retreats. They were always something quite special and not your average retreat. It's not like I want people to feel like they can have a kind of spiritualized vacation around me. That's not what I'm here to do at all. I don't want to facilitate for that. So I am increasingly moving towards that model of more invitation. But if you're hearing this and you're like, whoever this person is, I need to talk to them more. And hey, I want to go on these pilgrimages. Yeah. Well,
go to your mystery school.
Oh, the mystery school is just so boss. I want to say to everybody, if you're not sure
about anything, what the hell you've been talking about, like,
if you're not sure about anything in your own life, if you're not sure about anything in your own life, come to mystery school. It's so, honestly, Peter, I really want you to come. It would be so fun also for you to come to London.
Identified, I'm really not sure about anything in my own life.
No, honestly, it's so fun for community. It definitely brings forth the brightest quirkiness out of everybody who attends. Somehow it's just that kind of an event.
Well, I'm sure you some kind of a community that well. Yeah.
But it's also, we hold it, it's its own pilgrimage for people coming from the States, because we rent this library in this art center in the center of Bloomsbury in London, which is center of town. And it's this amazing Victorian building with this sort of incredible library with these amazing sort of incredible sculptures and it just big Chesterfields and big fireplace. I mean, it's just like Hogwarts or some shit. I mean, it's really sort of very funny and charming.
Is there information about that? Like
everything's on my website.
When's the next mystery school starting?
Mystery school starts 17th October 2025, I'm pretty sure. So it runs Thursday to Tuesday. So it's Friday night and then Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. Okay. I think it's that weekend of the 17th of October.
Oh, cool. So we've got some time.
Oh yeah, you've got some time.
All right.
But Divine Mother is open to everybody. Divine Mother people can just say like, I want to come.
Divine Mother is to Southern India.
Paris, no. See, three pilgrimages. It's complicated. Stuff.
Yeah. Okay. So that's the European one. In
Paris, Provence, and Montserrat.
Okay.
And it's one of those where you could like just come to Paris. In fact, if you're newer, might be an idea. Like, I'm going to just come to Paris first because it's just over a long weekend, Thursday to Sunday. Mm-hmm. Provence is like a solid week. And then Montserrat is like another 4 or 5 days on the other side of that.
Okay. All right. Before I let you go, because, and this is, I think we've talked about this before, but I've wanted to get your take on this.
I'm dying. What you got? What do you want to say? What are you going to ask?
Well, because you are one of the most, you appreciate aesthetics and cultivate and curate aesthetics in a way, in an intelligence more than as much, let's just say as much as anyone that I personally know. And you have a profound appreciation for beauty. But what I'm curious about is the shadow side of beauty.
Ooh, that's hot.
What going back to what we first started talking about at the beginning of the podcast of because so much of the time, like, beauty is like a striving, like, I want to be prettier, I want to be younger, or I want to be prettier, and it's like this. So it's like you can hear and see the colonization of the mind in that we have to be something other than we are to be okay, to be good enough, to be beautiful.
Yeah.
So I guess I just wonder, like, for you, in your mind, what's the relationship between, like, where's the place of beauty and how do you understand and hold beauty?
Wow, I really feel kind of flummoxed by the question, because in some ways I'm like, I just do. Like, I think that one of the things that I remember, like, okay, so I had this really like snobby indoctrination to beauty. I was always had like I don't know what you'd call maybe like aesthetic flair or something like that. When I was in high school, I got so frustrated with my classmates that I taught a class on aesthetic choice. I like asked the art teacher, I was like, can I just bring in some objects and like just teach people like about how they choose based on aesthetics and like get them, She was like, sure. And I brought in this like nested pile of like electrical wires that are all different colors and like, one of those Issey Miyake perfume bottles, with the frosted, the sort of from the late 80s, the Issey Miyake perfume. Anyway, I brought in a bunch of these objects and I was like, which one do you prefer? People were like, what the fuck? I was like, can you see that you're making an aesthetic choice? Anyway, that was me at 16.
Which brings in like the whole idea of preference and of taste, which is, I don't know. I'd be curious to hear what you say. That's kind of on one end of the spectrum of discrimination. So where's the line between discrimination and preference and taste?
I mean, I think that I think it's all about like how this is all ordered in your own consciousness and how deeply it reflects your own values. Mm-hmm. So for somebody like me, like I remember like a major breakthrough. So I had this major snobbiness indoctrination into all of this stuff because I moved to the UK in 1993 and was just literally like, like a kind of scene where somebody who has no, like apparently no talents and isn't dressed right and is just a mess, like somehow lands on stage and there's like 5,000 people out there. You know, it was a little bit like that. I was like, what the fuck? Suddenly I was with people who, you know, had profoundly cultivated taste, had huge egoic identity kind of built up around their taste or their intellectual prowess with regard to making art and all of these different things. And I ended up falling in love with and going out with this guy who was like, you know, I mean, this guy, I remember being on a bus with him in London, and he used to point out like, this building is so good in that building. And I was like, what the hell is he talking about? And I'd be like, yeah, I guess it's a good building. And then I was like, I need to understand what a good building is. I need to know I need to understand all of this. And I remember like being on the bus with him and being like, darling, that's a good building, isn't it? And he didn't even look up for his paper. He knew London so well. He knew from where we were on the bus. Without even looking up, he just said, bit reactionary, darling. And now, of course, I ended up moving to a place where I was really close to that building, looked at it all the time. I was like, he's right, it's a bit reactionary. A very conservative kind of building, not a particularly imaginative one. But I also see what I liked about it. So even then I was making a kind of like a choice that reflects something about the kinds of lines and the sort of visual stories I tend to appreciate. So this is by way of saying I had this immense immersion into this kind of intense snobbery, like this sort of really over the top kind of outlandish, you know, snobbery of early 90s young British artist scene Britain. And I was a teenager and everybody else was like 10 years older than me. And I knew fucking nothing. I literally come from like art class in high school in Delaware directly to like opening, you know, at the White Cube in London. I mean, it was like, there was like no space between those two occurrences from art class and opening at the White Cube, you know, Tracy Emin's first show at the White Cube. Mm-hmm. So it was really far out and very like, you know, baptism in taste by fire, you know, because I'm literally at this dinner, you know, seated next to somebody who's, you know, art collection, who has met every famous artist who's lived and died in the past 30 years. And whose art collection is worth more than I'll ever earn in the course of my entire life, even if I become a very wealthy person, you know? Mm-hmm. Anyway, so I remember my granddaddy, and then, you know, I would go home to like Delaware and to my mom's house and to like this very different world of taste and culture. And I remember, you know, being really snobby with my mom and like, why do you live in a house like this? You know, like this kind of like really appalling late adolescent child that I'd become. And I remember being like, we'd be driving around, we'd go to like a parking garage and I'd be like, that parking garage is the best building in this whole town. You know? Anyway, I was such an asshole. But I remember being in my grandfather's house, and my granddaddy had downsized from this house that I spent a lot of time in by the river, Road River, just off of Chesapeake in Maryland. And he downsized, and he was living in like one of those like trailer houses things, right? You know, in the time before he died, he moved, which was like a retirement community. They're very small homes. They're not exactly trailers. They're not mobile. I don't know what they are, but they're like, it was just sort of cheap house, you know? Mm-hmm. And I remember going in there and sitting there in like the cheapest house, you know, money can buy kind of thing, and looking around and just loving it so much because it's full of all of my granddaddy's collections of weird shit and all the shit that he would buy at all the, you know, yard sales that I'd been with him. I'd been to yard sales and I realized I developed a lot of my aesthetic sensibility in going to yard sales with my grandfather, you know, and just looking at all these weird discarded objects and having a relationship to them. And relationship to the past and all of these things through objects. And I remember just loving it and it was like such a profound revelation for me about taste and I think that the key word is appreciation. Mm. So I would say that it's more important in my value system to offer appreciation to what's there than it is to discern how beautiful this is on the most elaborate sort of, I don't know, you know, Met Gala spectrum of, you know, artistic expression.
Yeah. Good. Appreciation. I like that. Appreciation, gratitude.
And also there's something, you know, there's a little of the art historian in me, right? I trained in art history as an undergrad, and it's also like recognizing that every object tells a story. It tells a political story. It tells a an energetic story. There's not an object. It's telling more than just its use value, but it's also telling more than its aesthetic value. And that's where appreciation comes in.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, ultimately, if you take appreciation to the priestess level, that's where you start seeing through walls, because you can see what the walls are made of.
What do you mean by that? You can see what the walls are made of by
You can see through a wall if you understand everything about the process by which it came to be a wall, and every hand that was involved in the forming of the wall, and the entire energy, the raison d'etre, all of the things that had to occur for that wall to be made.
Mm-hmm.
That wall, that outer facing wall of that particular building. I mean, that's appreciation, right? When you look at it and you can see through it. You both because you can understand what's on the other side, but because you understand everything. And it's not like I understand it intellectually. It's like understanding all at once of the power and the energy that gave rise to the Caribbean. This is the arts of the Christ family, in my regard, is this sort of energetic working where, this idea of like being able to do these things that sound like miracles. Well, the miracle is only ever in your own perception. To be able to perceive the origin of things in everything, the process of things in everything, to really, to be so deep in the eternal that the temporal can't help but show itself for what it is.
Which is beautiful and part of the eternal.
Yeah. Yes.
All right. Well, let's leave it there. Leila Sadeghee, thank you for talking with me.
Huggies. I'm making a hugging gesture.
Yeah. And encourage everyone to reach out to Leila. She's a very friendly lass. And until next time, we'll talk to you. We'll see you next time.
I got to say thank you so much, Peter. It's a real honor. I didn't say that in the beginning because I was just like, I don't know.
No. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're so
really
brilliant, and it comes through. And I think hopefully a lot of value was conveyed to the listeners through this podcast. So thank you. I'm Peter Gold. She's Leila Sadeghee. We will talk to you next time. Thanks for tuning in, everybody, and listening. Bye for now.